The Great Frost of 1683 to 1684. In the winter of 1683, the rivers of Europe turned to stone. The Thames froze so solid that a city rose upon it. The canals of Holland became silent roads to nowhere, and across the continent, in villages and capitals alike, people faced a cold so deep, so relentless, that some wonder if spring would ever come again. This is the story of the Great Frost, not as historians tell it, but as those who lived it felt it. The silence, the hunger, the strange beauty of a world transformed, and the quiet resilience of ordinary people who had no choice but to endure. If you stay until the end, you will walk with them through frozen streets, stand beside them on the ice of the Thames, and feel the weight of a winter that passed into legend. Let us begin. In the final decades of the 17th century, Europe moved to rhythms that had remained largely unchanged for generations. The great cities of the continent, London, Amsterdam, Paris, Hamburg, had grown into centers of commerce and culture, their streets alive with the noise of trade, the rumble of carts over cobblestones, the cries of merchants hawking their wares. Rivers served as highways, carrying goods and people to the heart of nations. The Thames wound through London like a great artery, its waters bearing coal from the north, wool from the countryside, wine from distant shores. The canals of the Dutch Republic formed an intricate web connecting villages to cities, farmers to markets, the interior to the sea. Life depended on water and motion, on currents that never ceased, on the assumption that rivers would always flow. Winter, of course, brought its hardships. The people of northern Europe expected cold. They expected frost on the windows and ice at the edges of ponds. They expected to wrap themselves in wool and huddle closer to their hearths. But winter was a season to endure, not a catastrophe to survive. The cold would come, and then it would pass, and the rivers would continue their ancient work. This was the order of things. This was the world as it had always been. No one in the autumn of 1683 could have known that the winter approaching would be unlike any in living memory. No one could have foreseen that the rivers themselves would turn to stone, that the very fabric of daily life would be suspended, that the cold would arrive not as a visitor, but as an occupying force that would not leave for months. The Great Frost, as it would come to be known, was still weeks away, still gathering somewhere in the vast frozen reaches of the north, still invisible to the merchants and farmers and fishermen who went about their business as they always had, trusting in the patterns of the world they knew. But the world was about to change. And when it did, it would change so completely, so profoundly, that those who lived through it would speak of it for the rest of their lives, and their children would speak of it after them, and the memory of that winter would pass into legend, into the records of scholars and the stories of ordinary people, into the collective memory of a continent that had learned, in those frozen months, just how fragile the rhythms of civilization could be. To understand what was about to happen, one must first understand the world that existed before the freeze, a world of movement, of commerce, of water that never stopped flowing. London in 1683 was a city still rebuilding from a great fire that had consumed much of its medieval heart just 17 years earlier. New streets had risen from the ashes, new buildings of brick and stone replacing the old timber structures that had burned so readily. The city had grown, spreading outward along the banks of the Thames, its population swelling toward 500,000 souls. It was dirty, crowded, magnificent, and alive with ambition. The river was its lifeblood, from the Pool of London to the wharves that lined both banks, ships and barges, and wherries crowded the water, loading and unloading goods from every corner of the known world. Watermen ferried passengers across the current for a penny, their small boats weaving between larger vessels with practiced ease. The sound of the river was the sound of the city itself. The creak of ropes, the splash of oars, the shouts of boatmen, the constant background murmur of water in motion. Upstream, beyond the city, the Thames wound through countryside that had not yet been swallowed by urban expansion. Farmers brought their produce to market by water when they could, the river offering easier passage than the rutted roads that turned to mud with every rain. Downstream, the estuary opened toward the sea, toward the trading routes that connected England to the continent and beyond. The Thames was more than a river. It was a highway, a marketplace, a source of livelihood for thousands. To imagine it frozen, To imagine it silent and still would have seemed absurd, a fantasy, a thing that happened in old stories but not in the modern world. Across the North Sea, the Dutch Republic had built its entire civilization on water. The canals that crisscross the lowlands were not merely decorative features, but essential infrastructure, the roads upon which an entire economy moved. In winter, when the canals froze, people strapped blades to their shoes and skated to market, gliding over ice that was usually thin and temporary. The freeze was an inconvenience, sometimes a pleasure, rarely a disaster. The Dutch had learned to live with their watery landscape, to adapt to its moods, to work with the rhythms of freeze and thaw that marked the turning of the seasons. Their cities, Amsterdam, Leiden, Haarlem, Delft, were miracles of engineering, built on land reclaimed from the sea, protected by dikes and drained by windmills. Water was everywhere, and everywhere was controlled, channeled, made to serve human purposes. In Paris, the Seine divided the city into its ancient halves, its bridges crowded with shops and houses, its banks lined with mills and laundries and the homes of fishermen. The river had frozen before, in winters past, but never for long. The memory of truly severe cold had faded from living experience. The court at Versailles was preoccupied with matters of state, with the ambitions of the Sun King, with the endless intrigues and ceremonies that occupied the aristocracy. Winter was a season for hunting, for balls, for the pleasures of the fireside. The poor, of course, suffered more, crowding into cramped rooms, burning whatever fuel they could find, hoping the cold would pass before the worst of their provisions ran out. But this was the way of things. This was how winter had always been. Further north, in the German states and Scandinavia, cold was a more familiar companion. The Baltic froze regularly. The rivers of northern Germany turned to ice for weeks at a time. The forests stood silent under blankets of snow. But even in these harder climates, there were limits to what people expected. There were extremes that existed only in stories, in the account of ancient chroniclers, in the warnings of old men who claimed to remember winters that their listeners privately doubted had ever truly occurred. The autumn of 1683 passed without unusual incident. The harvest had been adequate, not abundant but sufficient. The leaves turned and fell, the days shortened, the first frosts touched the land. In the cities, people began to prepare for winter as they always did, laying in supplies of coal and wood, mending clothes, checking the seals around windows and doors. The wealthy ordered new furs, new cloaks, new hangings for their bedchambers. The poor patched what they had and hoped it would be enough. No one looked to the sky with unusual concern. No one sensed that something was different. The cold, when it began to arrive in early December, seemed at first like any other winter cold, sharp, bracing, nothing that hadn't been endured before. But it did not relent. It deepened. It settled over the continent like a weight, pressing down on the land, seeping into walls and bones and the very air itself. And still it grew colder. The cold arrived not with sudden shock, but with a gradual, inexorable pressure. In the first days of December, the temperature began to fall, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The morning frost grew thicker. The puddles in the streets froze and did not thaw by midday. The breath of horses and men hung in the air like smoke, lingering longer than it should have, as if the cold itself were reluctant to release anything from its grip. At first, people remarked on it the way they might remark on any unusual weather, with interest, with mild complaint, with the assumption that it would soon pass. Conversations in taverns and marketplaces turned to the cold, to the early depth of winter, to memories of other hard years. Old men claimed to remember worse. Young men boasted that they did not feel it. Women drew their shawls tighter and hurried through their errands, eager to return to the warmth of their kitchens. But the cold did not pass. It deepened. By the middle of December, the rivers of northern Europe had begun to slow, their surfaces thickening with ice that crept outward from the banks. The Thames, which had remained open and navigable through so many winters, began to show signs of freezing. The watermen noticed first the way their oars met resistance, the way ice formed on the blades between strokes, the way the current seemed sluggish, reluctant, as if the river itself were growing tired. Trade slowed. Ships that should have departed found themselves unable to move. Cargo sat on the wharves, waiting for waters that refused to clear. In the Dutch Republic, the canals froze solid within days. At first, this brought the usual pleasures: children skating, merchants traveling by sled, the strange joy of moving across water that had turned to ice. But the freeze continued, deepening beyond anything in recent memory. The ice grew thicker and thicker, until it could bear the weight of loaded carts, until it seemed less like frozen water, and more like a new kind of road, permanent and unyielding. The windmills that drained the polders stood still, their mechanisms frozen, their sails motionless against the gray sky. The water that they were meant to keep at bay was no longer moving anyway. Everything was still. In Paris, the Seine froze from bank to bank. The mills that had ground flour for the city fell silent, their wheels locked in ice. The laundresses who worked along the river found their trade impossible. The fishermen had nothing to catch. The bridges across the Seine now spanned not flowing water, but a white, silent road of ice that stretched as far as the eye could see. The city, which had always been defined by its river, by the movement of boats and barges and the cries of boatmen, grew quiet in ways that unsettled those who noticed. The cold penetrated everywhere. It crept through walls, through shuttered windows, through the cracks around doors. It found its way into bedchambers and kitchens, into shops and churches, into the bones of the old and the sick. The fires that burn in hearths and stoves seemed to give less heat than they should, as if the cold were somehow consuming the warmth before it could spread. People slept in their clothes, piled blankets and cloaks, and anything they could find on top of themselves, and still woke shivering in the darkness before dawn. The sounds of the world changed. The usual noise of cities, the clatter of wheels, the shouts of vendors, the constant background of human activity, grew muffled, subdued. Snow absorbed sound. Ice silenced the rivers. The birds that should have filled the winter air with their calls were gone, fled south or dead in the cold. At night, the silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional crack of expanding ice, a sound like distant gunfire that echoed through the frozen streets. And still the cold deepened. December gave way to January, and the freeze showed no sign of relenting. The thermometers at the educated classes consulted with growing alarm recorded temperatures that seemed impossible, that exceeded anything in their experience or their records. This was not merely a hard winter. This was something else entirely. By the second week of January 1684, the Thames had frozen so completely that people began to walk across it. At first, only the most daring ventured onto the ice, young men proving their courage, curious onlookers testing the surface with careful steps. But as the days passed and the freeze continued, as the ice grew thick enough to bear any weight, the frozen river became a new kind of public space, a white expanse in the heart of London that existed nowhere else, that would never exist again once the thaw came. What happened next was something that no one could have planned, that emerged spontaneously from the strange circumstances of that frozen winter. The people of London, confined by cold, their normal routines disrupted, their livelihoods threatened, did what people have always done in times of crisis. They found ways to carry on, to adapt, to make the best of impossible circumstances. They built a city on the ice. It began with vendors who set up stalls along the frozen river, selling hot food and drink to those who had come to marvel at the spectacle. Pie sellers and roast meat merchants, purveyors of ale and cider and mulled wine. They wheeled their carts onto the ice and did business, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The crowds that gathered encouraged others to follow. Soon there were puppet shows and printing presses, archery ranges and bowling alleys, bull baiting and fox hunting, all arranged along the ice as if it were a new kind of fairground that had materialized in the middle of the city. They called it the Frost Fair, though no one had declared it a fair. No one had organized it. No one had given it a name until it already existed. It grew organically, spreading across the frozen Thames from bank to bank, a temporary city of tents and booths and makeshift entertainments. The king himself came down to the ice, walking among his subjects in a display of solidarity with the common people who were enduring the same cold that chilled the halls of Whitehall. Printers set up their presses and struck commemorative souvenirs, pamphlets and cards bearing the names of visitors, proof that they had walked on the frozen Thames, mementos of a winter that would not be forgotten. The atmosphere on the ice was strange, almost dreamlike. The normal rules of London life seemed suspended. The river that had always divided the city now united it, offering a space where people of all classes mingled more freely than they did on the crowded streets above. There was laughter and music, the smell of roasting meat and burning charcoal, the shouts of vendors and the squeals of children sliding on the ice. For a few weeks, in the depths of the worst winter in memory, the frozen Thames became a place of unexpected joy, a celebration of survival, a defiant answer to the cold that had transformed the world. But the joy was fragile, and it existed alongside suffering that the fair could not erase. The same ice that bore the weight of entertainers and crowds also meant that no ships could move, that no coal could be delivered, that the normal commerce on which the city depended had ground to a halt. The price of fuel soared beyond what the poor could afford. Families burned their furniture to stay warm, then burned the timbers of their homes, then huddled together in the cold with nothing left to burn. The hospitals filled with the frostbitten and the sick. The grave diggers struggled to break the frozen earth. The frost fair was a marvel, but it was also a symptom, a sign of how completely the natural order had been disrupted, how desperate people were for distraction, how strange the world had become when a river could turn into a road and the heart of a great city could transform into a frozen playground. Those who walked on the ice and marveled at the spectacle were also walking on a disaster, on months of economic ruin and human suffering, on a winter that would leave scars long after thaw revealed them. In the Dutch Republic, there were no frost fairs, only the hard reality of a freeze that had paralyzed an entire nation built on water. The canals that served as highways were now useless for commerce, frozen too solid for boats, yet often too rough for skating or sledding over long distances. The wind that swept across the flat landscape found no obstruction, carrying the cold into every town and village with ferocity that made the air itself feel like a weapon. The windmills stood motionless, their great sails still against a gray sky. Without them, the water that constantly threatened to reclaim the low-lying land could not be pumped away. In ordinary winters, this mattered little. The freeze was temporary. The thaw would come. The mills would turn again. But as the weeks passed and the cold showed no sign of breaking, anxiety grew. The dikes that held back the sea were engineered for water, not for the pressure of expanding ice. Cracks appeared in the earthworks, small at first, then larger. The engineers who maintained these vital structures worked in conditions that numbed their hands and slowed their thoughts, struggling to shore up defenses against an enemy they had never been designed to fight. In the cities, fuel grew scarce. The peat that heated Dutch homes normally arrived by barge, but the barges were locked in ice. The forests that might have provided wood were far away, across frozen waterways that could not be easily crossed. People burned what they could find: furniture, fencing, the wooden shoes that were so common in the countryside. The poor suffered terribly. The orphanages and hospitals, always underfunded, now faced the prospect of watching their charges freeze. Churches opened their doors as shelters, their congregations huddling together for warmth that no number of bodies could quite provide. The famous skating culture of the Dutch, so often depicted in the paintings of the era, took on a different character in this winter. The frozen canals were not playgrounds but necessities, the only way to travel when the roads were blocked by snow and the waterways were locked in ice. Farmers skated to market with what little they had to sell, their breath freezing on their scarves, their fingers aching inside their gloves. Doctors skated to patients who might be dead before they arrived. Ministers skated to parishioners who needed comfort that no fire could provide. The graceful images of winter recreation that artists had captured in gentler years gave way to the grim reality of survival, of movement as necessity rather than pleasure. The herring fleet, on which so much of Dutch prosperity depended, sat frozen in the harbors, unable to reach the fishing grounds that provided food and income for thousands. The Baltic trade, which brought grain and timber from the east, was suspended entirely. The great merchant houses of Amsterdam watched their ledgers turn red, their investments stranded, their contract impossible to fulfill. The economy of the Republic, so dependent on the movement of goods by water, shuddered under the weight of the freeze. And still the cold continued. In the countryside of England, France, and the German states, the great frost brought devastation of a different kind. The crops that remained in the ground, the winter wheat, the root vegetables, the orchards that would bear fruit in spring, froze solid. The ground itself became as hard as stone, impossible to work, impossible even to dig graves for those who died. Livestock perished in their barns, their water troughs frozen, their fodder running out. Farmers who had expected a difficult winter found themselves facing ruin. The isolation was profound. Villages that normally maintained contact with neighboring communities found themselves cut off, the roads impassable, the usual networks of trade and communication severed. News traveled slowly, distorted by rumor and fear. Stories circulated of entire families found frozen in their homes, of wolves driven by hunger to attack the living, of travelers lost in snowdrifts never to be seen again. Some of these stories were true. Others were exaggerations born of genuine terror. In the silence of that frozen winter, it was often impossible to tell the difference. The rivers that served as boundaries between territories, that powered mills and provided fish, that had shaped the geography of human settlement for centuries, were transformed into something else entirely. They became obstacles rather than highways, barriers rather than connections. The bridges that crossed them, built for water that moved, now spanned ice that stretched unbroken from bank to bank. In some places, the ice was thick enough that armies could have marched across. In others, it was treacherous, solid-looking but weak, waiting to swallow anyone who trusted its surface. In the forests, the cold killed trees outright. The sap within them froze and expanded, splitting trunks with sounds like cannon fire that echoed to the silence of the woods. Birds fell from the branches, frozen in mid-flight, their small bodies littering the snow beneath the trees. Deer and wild boar, desperate for food, ventured close to human settlements, where they were sometimes killed for their meat and sometimes left alone by people too exhausted to hunt. The natural world, which normally carried on its business regardless of human affairs, was as disrupted as the world of men. The experience of the great frost differed vastly depending on who was enduring it. For the wealthy, the winter was an inconvenience, an interruption of normal pleasures, a topic of conversation at gatherings where fires blazed and food remained plentiful. The great houses of nobility were built to withstand cold, their walls thick, their hearts numerous, their stores deep. The aristocrats who shivered in their beds did so in rooms lined with tapestries, under blankets of wool and fur, with servants to tend the fires through the night. They complained, certainly. They found the cold tedious, the disruption of their social calendars annoying, the frozen roads an impediment to their movements. But they did not starve. They did not freeze. For the poor, the winter was a matter of survival. In the cramped tenements of London, in the narrow houses of Amsterdam, in the hovels of the rural countryside, families faced choices that no one should have to make. Burn the last of the fuel, and hope for a thaw that might not come. Eat the seed corn that was meant for spring planting, and pray that somehow there would be more. Send the children to beg, knowing that the cold might kill them before charity could save them. The death toll of that winter was never precisely counted. It was dispersed across too many villages, too many parishes, too many unmarked graves, but it was substantial. The poor died of cold, of hunger, of diseases that flourish in weakened bodies, of accidents on treacherous ice, of despair that made them careless with their own lives. The middling sort, the merchants, the tradesmen, the skilled artisans, found themselves caught between worlds. They had resources that the poor lacked, but not enough to weather indefinite disruption. Their businesses depended on commerce that had ceased, on customers who could not reach them, on supplies that could not be delivered. They watched their savings dwindle, their credit stretch, their prospects dim. Some would recover when the thaw came. Others would find that the winter had ruined them, that the foundations of their prosperity had frozen and cracked like the rivers themselves. In the churches, the clergy struggled to make sense of what was happening. Was this cold a punishment from God, a sign of divine displeasure with a sinful world? Was it a test, a trial sent to strengthen the faithful? Was it simply the natural order, a reminder that human beings were small and fragile in the face of creation's power? The sermons of that winter reflected these anxieties, searching for meaning in suffering, offering comfort that felt inadequate to the scale of the disaster. The congregations who gathered to hear these words, fewer each week, as the cold kept many away, listened and prayed and hoped that somewhere, somehow, an answer might be found. The superstitions of the age flourished in the darkness of that frozen winter. Some blamed witchcraft, that reliable explanation for misfortune that the educated dismissed, but the common people still feared. Others looked to the heavens, searching for comets or eclipses or other celestial signs that might explain what was happening below. Almanacs were consulted, prophecies were remembered, old wives' tales were repeated with new urgency. In a world without meteorology, without satellite images or computer models, without any way to see the vast systems of pressure and temperature that govern the weather, people reached for whatever explanations they could find. The cold reached its peak in the first weeks of January, though no one knew at the time that they had passed through the worst of it. The temperatures that were recorded, and they were recorded by natural philosophers and curious gentlemen who kept careful notes, were extraordinary, lower than anything in the historical record, lower than anything that would be recorded again for centuries. The cold was not uniform across the continent. Some regions suffered more than others. Some cities were spared the very worst. But everywhere it was severe, everywhere it disrupted life, everywhere it left its mark. The psychological toll was as real as the physical suffering, though harder to measure. The endless gray skies, the short days and long nights, the isolation and the fear wore on people in ways that did not always show immediately. Marriages that had been stable began to fray under the pressure of confinement and anxiety. Children who had been lively grew quiet and listless. The old, who had seen much in their lives, spoke of giving up, of having lived too long, of being ready for an end that the cold seemed eager to provide. The winter pressed down on spirits as heavily as it pressed down on the land. Those who had the means to do so retreated into whatever warmth and comfort they could find. The coffee houses of London, those centers of news and gossip and political debate, became refuges where men gathered as much for the heat of the room as for the stimulation of conversation. The taverns did brisk business, selling warmth in the form of alcohol that burned in the stomach and dulled the awareness of cold. The churches, cold themselves but offering something beyond physical comfort, saw attendance rise and fall with the severity of each day's weather. And through it all, people adapted. They found ways to cope, to carry on, to maintain some semblance of normal life even when normality had been suspended. Markets continued to operate, though with reduced goods and elevated prices. Letters were written and somehow delivered. Babies were born and, against all odds, survived. The business of living did not stop simply because the world had frozen. It continued, diminished and difficult, but it continued. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing about that winter. Not the severity of the cold, which was extraordinary, but the persistence of human activity in the face of it, the stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to conditions that seemed designed to make life impossible. The thaw, when it finally came, arrived as gradually as the freeze had descended. In the last days of January and the first weeks of February, the temperatures began, slowly, to rise. The change was imperceptible at first, a degree or two, nothing that would have been noticed in an ordinary winter, but felt intensely after months of unrelenting cold. The ice that had seemed permanent began, almost imperceptibly, to soften. The sound of the world changed again. The crack and groan of breaking ice replaced the silence that had settled over frozen rivers. Water began to move, first in trickles, then in streams, then in torrents as the ice broke up and the current reasserted itself. The Thames, which had borne the weight of the frost fair, became treacherous, its surface fragmenting into flows that shifted and tilted without warning. The booths and stalls that had been built on the ice were dismantled in haste, their proprietors scrambling to salvage their goods before the river reclaimed its territory. The frost fair ended not with celebration but with urgency, with a sudden realization that what had seemed solid was now dangerous, that the ground beneath everyone's feet was turning back into water. Some were caught by the change, their carts and goods lost to the river as the ice gave way. Most escaped in time, carrying the memory of those strange weeks on the frozen Thames back to their ordinary lives, back to a world that was slowly, painfully, returning to normal. But normal, it became clear, would not return easily. The thaw revealed the damage that the freeze had concealed. The trees that had split in the cold stood shattered in the forest. They were useful for nothing but fuel. The crops that had frozen in the ground were dead, and the spring planting would have to make up for their loss. If there was seed to plant, if there was strength to work the still hard earth, if there was time before the growing season passed. The livestock that had perished in the cold had to be replaced, at prices that reflected scarcity. The infrastructure that had been neglected during the freeze, the roads, the bridges, the dikes and waterways, needed repair that communities could barely afford. The rivers that had frozen now flooded, the melting ice and accumulated snow producing torrents that overwhelmed banks and burst through barriers. The same water that had been so desperately missed during the freeze now became a threat, drowning fields, sweeping away bridges, claiming lives that had survived the cold only to fall to the water. The disaster of the Great Frost did not end with a thaw. It transformed, taking new shapes, finding new ways to bring hardship to people who had already endured so much. In the months and years that followed, the Great Frost of 1683 to 1684 passed into memory, into record, into the collective consciousness of a generation that had lived through something extraordinary. Those who had walked on the frozen Thames told their children, and their children told their children, and the story became part of the history of London, part of the identity of a city that had endured fire and plague, and war and cold, and survived them all. The commemorative souvenirs that had been printed on the ice became treasured possessions, proof of presence at an event that would not be repeated in any living memory. The natural philosophers of the age studied the Great Frost with the tools available to them, recording temperatures, collecting observations, tried to understand what had caused such an extraordinary winter. Their conclusions were tentative, their explanations incomplete. The science of meteorology did not yet exist in any form that could make sense of what had happened. The frost remained, in some ways, a mystery, a reminder that the natural world contained forces beyond human understanding, beyond human control. The economic consequences rippled outward for years. Trade patterns that had been disrupted did not immediately recover. Debts that had accumulated during the freeze weighed on families and businesses long after the ice had melted. The harvest of 1684, diminished by the damage to crops and livestock, meant that food remained expensive, that the effects of the winter continued to be felt at every table. Recovery was slow, uneven, incomplete for some who never quite regained what they had lost. The Great Frost entered the chronicles of the age, mentioned in histories and almanacs, referenced in sermons and pamphlets, becoming part of the cultural memory of late 17th century Europe. It became a benchmark against which future winters would be measured, a standard of severity that few would ever match. When old men spoke of hard winters, they spoke of 1683 to 1684, of the year the Thames froze, of the cold that seemed like it would never end. But memory is selective, and the Great Frost was remembered differently by different people. For some, it was a frost fair, the strange carnival on the ice, the unexpected pleasure amid the hardship. For others, it was hunger and cold, loss and suffering, the winter that took someone they loved or something they needed. For historians looking back from later centuries, it became a data point in the study of climate, evidence of a period that would come to be called the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long stretch of cooler temperatures that shaped European history in ways both obvious and subtle. The Great Frost was all of these things, and none of them captured it completely. There is a temptation, from the distance of centuries, to draw lessons from the Great Frost, to find meaning in the suffering, to extract wisdom that might be applied to the present. But the people who lived through that winter did not experience it as a lesson. They experienced it as life, as the immediate and urgent business of surviving another day, of finding food and fuel and warmth, of protecting those they loved, of enduring what could not be avoided. They did not know they were living through history. They only knew they were cold. What remains after all the records have been consulted and all the accounts have been read is the image of a world transformed by cold. The frozen rivers, silent and white where they had been moving, and dark. The cities, their usual noise muffled, their usual rhythms disrupted. The countryside, locked in ice, its familiar patterns erased by snow. The people, wrapped in whatever they could find, their faces red with cold, their breath visible in the air, going about the business of living as best they could. The Great Frost did not destroy European civilization. It did not reshape the political map or topple governments or start wars. It was, in the sweep of history, an episode, extraordinary while it lasted, fading gradually from memory as those who lived through it grew old and died. But for those months, For that winter of 1683 to 1684, it was everything. It was a world, frozen and strange and terrifying, and in its own way beautiful. The ice melted. The rivers flowed again. Life returned to its familiar patterns, or something close to them, and the memory of the great frost settled into the past. One more story among the countless stories of human endurance, of survival, of the stubborn persistence of life in the face of forces that seem overwhelming. The winter ended, as all winters do. But those who lived through it never quite forgot the silence of the frozen rivers, the strange sight of a city built on ice, the bone-deep cold that it seemed like it might last forever. They carried that winter with them, a shadow in their memories, a reminder how quickly the familiar could become strange, how easily the solid ground could turn to ice beneath their feet. And somewhere in the records of the age, the great frost remains, not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a testament to what was endured, to what was survived, to the quiet resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary cold. The numbers in the ledgers, the dates in the diaries, the names printed on commemorative cards. These are what remain when the ice has long since melted, when the rivers have flowed for centuries, when the world has warmed and cooled and warmed again. The camera pulls back slowly from the frozen Thames, from the empty booths and scattered debris of the frost fair, from the gray sky and the white ice and the distant spires of London churches. The city endures as it has always endured. The river will flow again. The cold will pass, and spring will come, and life will continue in all its ordinary, extraordinary persistence. The great frost will become a memory, then a record, then a story told to those who cannot quite imagine what it was like to walk on water, to build fires on a frozen river, to survive a winter that seemed like it might never end. But for now, in the last days of that frozen February, the ice still holds. The world is still and white and silent. And somewhere in the cold, in the gray light of a winter afternoon, the people of Europe go about the business of living, as they always have, as they always will, enduring what must be endured, surviving what must be survived, waiting for thaw that they trust, despite everything, will eventually come. The great frost ended, as all things end. The ice melted. The rivers remembered how to move. And life, stubborn and persistent, returned to its familiar rhythms. But those who lived through that winter carried it with them, in their bones, in their stories, in the silence they heard whenever snow began to fall. History is filled with moments like this: forgotten winters, lost cities, ordinary people who endured extraordinary things and left only fragments behind, a name on a printed card, a date in a diary, a story passed down until no one remembers who first told it. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the cold and the silence and the strange beauty of that frozen world, then perhaps you'll walk with us again. There are other winters waiting, other cities, other stories that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe, and we will find them together.